Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. It's Marty, your fearless instructor. Hope you're all doing well. This is a video presentation. It might be about 25 minutes long. I'm going to try to go quick. But the bottom line is I have some important things in here about some details on the self-guided field trip, and of course the write-up for the week. And most of the discussion is going to be about race and whiteness. And definitely look at this as a resource, meaning the presentation, the slides, as a resource you can draw upon and utilize for some of the work that's remaining in the semester. So of course, go through the video carefully, pay attention. But again, it's a presentation to give you some tools, perspectives that you can employ and deploy in your write-ups for this week, as well as the self-guided field trips 1 and 2, which I'll talk about at the end. So let's get going. So we have race. So this week the readings deal with the history of the KKK in Denver, a little bit of Colorado Springs and Pueblo, and then also white fragility. So the presentation I'm going to focus on today is to give you a little bit of a robust foundation about race and anthropology, and things that can help you make sense. And of course, in this class, and I'll talk about this later, your job this week in the discussion, the write-up, you need to use some of the concepts in the presentation, in the readings, as well as one of the videos you watch. You need to use them and apply them and interrogate them in your write-up. So I'm going to return to that this point later on in the presentation, but just to emphasize that you will not get full points unless you demonstrate you are able to pull something and apply something from both the readings as well as one of the videos you watched for this week. And of course, do not procrastinate, plan ahead. Those 3 films, I believe you have to go to a movie theater. So good luck with time management. So again, race, a group of populations that share characteristics due to common ancestry. A couple bullet points. Race usually refers to a topology, a system of classification, different categories. Now, I'm not going to give an overview of the history of racial classification, but the key thing to remember, one of the founding fathers who promoted like a science of race, if you will, or the classification and categorization of race was Carl Linnaeus in 1735, and he came up with 4 groups. The key point is the groups themselves typically put Western Europe or white people always as the dominant race. And that was a reoccurring theme throughout all the individuals that classified race. So black people were sort of the lower end of the totem pole, if you will, and brown people, yellow people. So the racial categorization and the systems of classification always had white people as superior. So from the onset, there was problems with the racial classification. So now within the field of anthropology, typically we avoided race, meaning the last 100, 200 years or so in the social sciences. But we do believe that race cannot be separated from racism. And then of course, race grounds material reality. So your reality with your material existence, whether it's tangible things like commodities or just your economic existence, race is infused in that. And so we try to make sense of that as anthropologists. Now, of course, there's this myth that we should live in a colorblind society. Now, on the surface, that sounds great. Colorblind society. But as in White Fragility, in that book, the author talks about some of the problems. In fact, later on, there's a video presentation you have an option to watch. He goes into it. There's problems with this color blindness, and I'll go into it also in a second. So another definition of race or races, cultural historical formations that may also entail positive affirmations of social identity and acts of survival. Now, in anthropology, one scholar who has been influential is Franz Boas. He assigned race to biology. The key thing is race is important, but culture is more important. So the definition by Boas for culture, learned behavior, not biologically inherited traits, whereas race, it refers to biologically inherited traits, and it's not learned behavior. So anthropologists tend to look at culture, which is a driving force for understanding transformation, for example. So Boasians, those individuals that take up his theories and his approach to anthropology, they agree that race is not meaningful in terms of explaining differences among humans and culture is a more meaningful explanation of social differences. Now, two other scholars go deeper, and they talk about race as a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. And then the key term is racial formations, the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. Now, it's really important to look at Du Bois and his concept of race, because he defines it referring to different forces, facts, and tendencies. In other words, when you talk about race, there's certain things that have happened in history which are important and you can't deny. So here's 4 of them. Number 1, Middle Passage, which basically means that the transportation of slaves, West Africa and other parts of Africa, to, for example, North America. So that greatly shapes the foundation and our knowledge about race. So the Middle Passage, slavery, and the experience of racial terror produce a race of African Americans out of subjects drawn from different cultures. Number 2, a contradictory force, facts, and tendency to help us understand race. From Du Bois, genocide, forced removal to reservations, and the experience of racial terror make Native American subjects drawn from different linguistics and tribal affiliations a race. Okay, so this is also part of the explanation of the race. 2 other points. War relocation camps, legal exclusion, and the experience of discrimination make Asian American subjects drawn from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds a race. The process of forming the southwestern states of the United States through conquest and subjugation and the continued subordination of Puerto Rico constitute Chicanos and Puerto Ricans as races. So these are different elements in historical facts that help, at least from Du Bois' perspective, understand race. Now, you can't talk about race, especially in the projects you're going to be working on, not only your discussion write-ups, but also if you choose the Stapleton campaign issue and the race/community option for the self-guided field trips in the course. Whitewashing is a pivotal concept to think about. So we have to start with racial identity, defined as an individualized process and formation of social groups organized around material interests with their roots in social structure, not just individual consciousness. So here what I want to emphasize is this ideology of color blindness that I mentioned earlier. So here's this ideology, and really it's like framed as like, oh, I don't see color, which is a famous Stephen Colbert, a comedian, he uses all the time, and he does it sarcastically. Or people tend to say, oh yeah, I don't subscribe to, racial differences, and I look beyond race. So that's part of this ideology of being colorblind. So here's a couple of problems with that. It's this claim that racism is a thing of the past and that race no longer matters in American society. This colorblind racial ideology also refers to the perspective that racial inequality is due to the failure of individuals to take advantage of opportunities for mobility. In some cases, this colorblind racial ideology leads to the claim that white Americans experience significant race-based economic and cultural victimization. Now here's a couple, 2 slides. As you get deeper into thinking about race as it applies to diversity, equity, or racial injustice, or specifically as you pursue activities for your self-guided field trips, or even just the write-up, here's a couple questions to think about. How does your racial identity interact with your culture, beliefs, family, and experiences to shape your understanding of white privilege? And I'm going to talk about white privilege in a second to ensure that we have a strong definition of that. Another question to ask yourself, what does it mean to you, if anything, to identify with your racial group? Does race/ethnicity affect your life goals? Another question, how would you rate your own preparedness to have an effective conversation about race? Very unprepared or very prepared? A couple other ones. Where do you have conversations about race? With whom? In these places, what are the 2 or more obstacles that get in the way of having meaningful conversations about race? Lastly, what is an issue along cultural, ethnic, gender, class, or community lines that you are concerned about that has a systematic racism component to it? And then in a second, I'll talk about systemic racism. Okay, and these are more questions. More questions, read them. You may find them useful, especially as you sit down and talk to someone in the community. Some of the questions provided here can be reframed. And of course, a reoccurring theme that I'm going to get back to toward the end of this presentation, and of course a reoccurring theme throughout the course, is most of what you're doing is about you. So you're going to do these self-guided field trips. You're going to maybe look a bit about the Stapleton campaign issue because of the write-up for this week about your own community and its historical significance. The point is for you to have a deeper critical understanding of your own position on race and problems, concerns you may have about it. So the point is the last couple slides with these questions are for you to repurpose or even try to answer. Okay, Systems of Privilege by Peggy McIntosh. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Access to privilege doesn't determine one's outcomes, but it is definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, and aspirations a person with privilege has will result in something positive for them. So we're going to begin to talk about whatever your position, whatever you self-identify. So for example, I identify like, white Latino. My dad's from Ecuador, and I definitely benefit from privilege of whether it's my class background or being part of a bicultural family. And so the privilege is something that we want to acknowledge, recognize, and try to understand. And of course, here's a definition by Peggy McIntosh that helps us start with issues of privilege. Now, white privilege, according to Paula Rothenberg, white privilege is the other side of racism. So the note here is as you work in the course on issues connected to race, for example, when you define racism, the other side of this issue is white privilege. So try to take a holistic view when you're applying these terms and writing about them, and recognize that white privilege is a huge part of understanding and making sense of racism. So unless we name it, we are in danger of wallowing in guilt or moral outrage with no idea of how to move beyond them. It is often easier to deplore racism and its effects than to take responsibility for the privileges some of us receive as a result of it. Once we understand how white privilege operates, we can begin addressing it on an individual and institutional basis. That last line, once we understand how white privilege operates, we can begin addressing it on an individual institutional basis. For example, in your discussion write-up, you can pivot your whole contribution, what you write, on that last sentence, saying, in this discussion contribution, it's my good faith effort to try to make sense of understanding how white privilege operates, and the way you're going to do that is through holding our hand through your new knowledge or your concerns, your thinking about community as it relates to a history of racial injustice. Now, here's a couple examples of privilege. And again, if you took the time, you can easily make a laundry list. And there's lists everywhere on the internet that you can also check out. Examples of privilege: being able to assume that most of the people you or your children study in history classes and textbooks will be of the same race, gender, or sexual orientation as you are. Another example: assume that your failures will not be attributed to your race or your gender. And of course, another example of privilege: not have to think about your race or your gender or your sexual orientation or disabilities on a daily basis. Okay, so here's now a whole nother area, and I just can emphasize again, what is here are resources for you to have a critical view, and really the purpose of the class is to get you to maybe release some of the thoughts that you have about diversity and try to approach it in a more holistic way. And so there's a couple terms, specifically racialization, racial embodiment, that help us sort of make sense, at least academically. And of course, your job is to understand some of these terms and apply them if it makes sense. So here's just 5 bullet points. I'm not going to read them all. The key thing is I'll just read the top one. Racialization, a complex contradictory process through which groups come to be designated as being a particular race, and on that basis subjected to differential and or unequal treatment. So definitely read all these and see if you can make sense of them, and of course the challenge is to apply them in a critical and deep manner, not a superficial way. So a couple additional terms, which we've already talked about: racism. Most of my work deals with labor and workers' rights, and so a really useful analytical tool is racialized labor. Something to think about if it applies to you and is of interest to you, read it and apply it in some of your work. And the definition is right there in front of you. A couple more terms: structural racism, overarching system of racial hierarchy and inequality across institutions and society. Now, the bottom term, to digress a minute, is really important because in our discipline of anthropology, or if you want to say diversity studies, it's really easy, and I know I said this before, it's really easy to have a laundry list of how crappy things are. Racial injustice, exploitation, economic inequality. And so in order to achieve justice, or to provide space for people to assert their rights so they can have racial equity, you need to have remedies. And so what you should think about in your work is at the very end, the last couple sentences, what is the remedy? It could be at a policy level. It could be something more basic in terms of what a community could do to address some of the racial issues or begin the process of racial healing. So the point is, begin to think of how you can be helpful as opposed to just pointing out the problems, which again, it's easy to do. It's hard to come up with a solution or set of recommendations that can address the lack of political will that exists. Okay, so one way to approach race is to reframe the foci. So, in other words, and I keep looking outside, by the way. I have a window, so I keep looking out there once in a while, just for fun. Cars drive by. We're actually renovating our basement, so they're today making a egress window. So they're digging down like 4 feet, and so there's a lot of stuff happening outside. So I just look outside once in a while. So basically, in terms of being productive, having discussions with people, rather than say who's a racist and talk about the causes, look at attitudes and intentions, personal prejudice, switch to what's causing the inequalities, what are the actions and impacts, and what are strategies and solutions to resolve some of this stuff. And then also there's racial justice, which is the opposite of structural racism. So again, structural racism, to unpack it, there's 5 or 6 things here. Social hierarchies, political disenfranchisement, social exclusion, criminalization, and dehumanization. These are elements of structural racism. Now what we want to do is be part of the solution to promote racial justice. That includes social justice, economic equity, legal fairness, and so on. Now there's different strategies for combating, countering, directly intervening in racism and all the ripple effects. There's internalized racism, which you could address through support groups, racial healing. There's interpersonal racism, so there's diversity trainings. In fact, later on there's this video that's a parody, and I really encourage you to watch it because it deals with white fragility in the workplace, and it's like 7 minutes long, but it's hilarious. And I use it as an optional video, but just to emphasize that with your work, to be effective, you can also use humor, and you can use comedy and parody. So in terms of interpersonal racism, there's trainings, cross-cultural dialogue, and then when institutional or structural racism are problems, there's other options to intervene. Okay, a little bit more about whiteness, and then white studies or whiteness studies. Okay, so whiteness, and I got a typo here, sorry about that. The nature and social impact of white racial identity. Whiteness emphasizes that whites are an important racial collectivity, and that it is important to understand how whites perform as racial actors. And then lastly, the hidden nature of whiteness has made it more difficult for many whites to understand the experiences of racial minorities and the persistence of racial inequality. And one way to think about this is as a cultural anthropology professor teaching courses like all the time about, one way to think about this is as a professor teaching courses about diversity and culture and all this other stuff, it's so amazing how many white students, Caucasian students, have such a hard time of grasping that they are a part of a culture. Now, whether they want to call it white culture or American culture, typically the narrow-minded thinking is that culture are like Latinos, or culture are like Romanians, or culture is something out there in like the jungles of Africa or whatever. So this is to celebrate and honor that there is a white culture, and to understand it critically can also help us deal with racism and promote racial justice. Now, there's an area called whiteness studies. The explicit focus on the socially constructed nature of white racial identity and the role of whiteness in the reproduction of racism and racial inequality. And there's three other things that are part of whiteness studies. Specifically, this idea of the importance of white racial invisibility and white privilege are main things that people in whiteness studies try to unpack and interrogate. So here's a couple criticism which are really important about whiteness studies. Tends to view whites as homogeneous, monolithic social entity where certain qualities are ascribed to all whites. Proponents often emphasize white identity and privilege while deflecting attention from key issues of power, inequality, and racism. So I apologize, one of the guys is outside drilling for our egress window, so just bear with me. I'm almost done. So a couple things to improve or make whiteness studies more sensitive. Must understand whiteness as it interrelates to racism and racial inequality. Must explore how variations in factors such as class and situation produce differences in the social roles of whiteness. Now, one of the readings today deals with excerpts from the book, Why It's So Difficult for White People to Talk About Race. And so here's a couple key points. Obviously, go through it carefully, but a few things to think about. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. Most white people live in a social environment that insulates them from race-based stress due to their privilege as part of the cultural majority. Whites are infrequently challenged and have less of a tolerance to race-based stress, causing them to be hostile, guilty, defensive, and fearful when confronted. White fragility ensures that conversations about race are derailed and the status quo of white supremacy is upheld. Of course, read the sections, and as I said earlier, it is a requirement, if you want to get full points in your write-up, to pull in some of these terms from the two readings and one of the videos you watch to demonstrate that you have a grasp of this stuff and you can relate it to the focus of the write-up. Okay, two videos that are optional, that are again optional, but you can't substitute these for one of the three that are already on the week 5 Canvas page. The 7-minute video I mentioned called White Fragility Workplace Training video is hilarious. I encourage you to watch it. Deconstructing White Privilege with Dr. Robin DiAngelo. So she's the author of White Fragility. So I encourage you to watch it. It's like 20 minutes and it gives you a little bit more material to think about and apply. Okay, so now I'm going to end here with a brief discussion about your homework, which is to write text to put on Canvas for a discussion called a write-up. So this is right out of the syllabus for the write-up for the week. Present a description, an analysis of your home community's name and its legacy along racial lines or related controversial lines. Now, some of you, if you don't plan properly, you're going to be stuck. So I encourage you to start early. You can go to the library. You can even, through the Auraria Library, remotely talk to people. You can also contact your city hall where the town is that you live. Or you can choose, I'm open to this, if you believe, and it wouldn't be that hard for me to verify or to say, hey, no, you got it wrong. If you believe you want to look at a different community, then go for it. So for example, I'm from Marin County, San Rafael specifically, and so in that city, there's a history of, for example, the Spaniards coming in and pushing Catholicism and wrecking, ruining, destroying the lives of American Indians. So that would be easy for me to research. It'd take me a few minutes to get some details to write that up. What you're supposed to do also is review the 2 cases. These are live links on the week 5 page for Stapleton and Dixie, and then just try to understand those cases and how they relate to these campaigns for name changing. And of course, what I'm doing for this week, it's actually a teaser or a preview to one of the options for the self-guided field trip focused on race and community. So I encourage you, if you think it's helpful, it's not a requirement, but I encourage you to actually read the description for this field trip option, because maybe as you do your write-up, you can begin to sketch or create a skeleton that could be the substance for your self-guided field trip focusing on the race community issue. So read the instructions for additional details. Now these are just cut out right from the syllabus about questions to guide your write-up. Don't freak out. You just have to look at these to guide your discussion. You don't have to answer every one, but there's a lot of issues in here that you may find helpful. And again, to emphasize for the 3rd time, for you to get full points on the write-up, you need to demonstrate to me that you can pull in and apply some ideas, concepts, issues from the 2 different readings and one of the films that you watch. And if you're not sure how to do that, just email me and I'm happy to work it through with you. Okay, now, because I want to ensure that everybody is on track and I want to get an idea of where people are going, it is a requirement by the 28th of September that each of you go to this Google Doc, and there'll be a live link in the message that I send you, and you need to fill in, number 1, your name, and for option 1, you got to give me a couple details. Don't stress about it. I just need some details of what your first option is and what your second option is, and of course, if you have any questions or whatever for me, let me know. So you need to do that by next Friday. And why I'm doing this is because I do not want at the week of the 9th of November, when the 2 self-guided field trips are due, for people to say, oh, we didn't plan very well, or you have ran out of time. So there's no excuse for that. So the key thing is, if you look under each option, number 6, you need to confirm with me that for at least self-guided field trip number 1, you have done by 19th of October. So about a month. And then you need to confirm with me that for option 2, you need to finish by the 9th of November. And so please fill that out by the 28th of September, which is next week. And so let me know if you have problems accessing the document. Now, for those of you that are interested in cannabis as one of your options, I'm looking for volunteers to come to this event on the 16th of October to basically attend the event and potentially be a volunteer, like sit at a table, or basically work at a conference as a volunteer to ensure like people have programs. There's probably only going to be 50 or 100 people. It's at University of Denver, October 16th. And I can even set up a camera for you to babysit if you want to just babysit a camera to film part of the lecture. And you can come at any time of the day. I just need to know in advance. And this could fulfill a major requirement for your option on the cannabis self-guided field trip option. So let me know ASAP. I need to know by Friday. And if you're not interested, no big deal. It's a conference on hemp or CBD research that you may find interesting or not. And you can also look at cbooutlook.com for more details. I believe this is the last slide. I have 2 study abroad courses I just want to share with you. One is in Malawi, Africa, called Media Anthropology, and the other one is in Holland that deals with hemp. So check these out. I'm happy to send more information, and if you're not interested, no big deal. But there are scholarships available, so if you want other people to pay for it, that's great. You should apply, and of course, I'm happy to talk further. All right, sorry for such a long presentation. Thank you so much, and good luck with the write-up, and I look forward to grading your papers that you submitted recently. All right, take care, bye.